Professor Edwards, good afternoon. Thank you for being here to give your evidence for the inspector. I'm not going to ask you to read your proof of evidence. I'm sure that we have all read and considered it. But I am going to ask you some key questions on some particular topics of importance based on the evidence that you've given. First, from paragraph 1 of your proof, I just want to confirm with you that you do have extensive planning and economics experience. You worked as an associate for Nathaniel Litchfield and Associates, and you joined the Bartlett School of Architecture and Planning as a lecturer for many years at UCL before retiring, and you are currently an honorary professor.
That's correct, and I'm continuing to work there part-time.
Thank you very much. Now, the questions I want to ask you are particularly focused on 3 areas. The first is the London level policy as it applies to markets in particular. The second is the broader London level policy considerations that apply to this case. And the third is a discrete topic, really, the alternative scheme and its viability, all of those topics you've referred to in the course of your proof. Now, at paragraph 7 of your proof, you refer to policy 4.8 of the London Plan on supporting a successful and diverse retail sector and related facilities and services. And I just want to ask you about the 2 sub-paragraphs that you refer to there. The first is sub-paragraph BC of policy 4.8, which refers to maintaining, managing and enhancing local and neighbourhood shopping and facilities which provide local goods and services with the aim of minimising the loss of retail. And you may have seen from paragraph 8.3.2 of the 2017 Equality Impact Assessment Update that one of the perceived dangers of the order scheme is the potential for loss of access to Latin American goods, services and facilities. Given that, are you able to comment on the degree to which the order scheme coheres or complies with the London Plan policies about the maintenance and enhancement of retail?
Do you want me to comment only on the specifically retail issues or more broadly on the compliance of the order scheme with the London Plan more generally? I can do either or both. I mean, both are relevant.
I think in the first instance I'm asking about markets and retail specifically, but I think later on we'll talk about the London Plan more broadly, so perhaps save that for later on in your evidence.
Okay. On this issue, I'll make some quick comments. I'd refer you also to what we heard from Dr. Patria Roman a few days ago, who was very helpful, and what we shall hear later today probably from Ivan Taylor. Both of them deal also with this question of markets policy in London. As you can see from policy 4.8, the successive London plans, and the 2016 one is the latest version, do attach importance to the role of markets and seek for their protection and support and enjoin boroughs to do what they can in that direction. I think that's important. And as Dr. Roman pointed out to the inspector when she was giving evidence, this latest version of the London Plan includes in the text below the policy some additional wording which emphasises the importance of ethnic or BME market activity as being of distinctive value. I'll just find the words if it's helpful. I can't see it this minute, but it was very clear in the evidence of Patria Roman, who pointed this out to us carefully. I can find it if we need to in a moment. I think the context here on retail policy is that the retail scene in Britain is changing rather fast, particularly as people are increasingly buying durable goods, comparison goods, clothes, household equipment, electronics and so on the internet, and they're being delivered direct to homes, with a consequent reduction in the turnover of physical shops in buildings. And the studies which the GLA has commissioned about the future of retailing, which underlie the policies that are in the plan, envisage that we shall see growth of retail, physical retail space, only in really the main shopping centres of London. That is the central activity zone centres, Oxford Street and the West End and so on, and places like big shopping centres at Stratford and Westfield in Shepherd's Bush, and probably another Westfield in Croydon and so on, and I guess Brent Cross, but that it will be a concentration of physical shopping space in those places and a survival of micro-local shopping space within walking distance of people's homes, but they expect to see the shrinkage of retail shopping space in intermediate size places. Now that's important in relation to this project here, because the order scheme, the Granger-Haringey scheme, clearly envisages trying to make Seven Sisters into a bit more of a substantial centre, accommodating more multiple national chain retailers. I think the planning officer referred to W.H. Smith and Boots as examples of the kinds of stores they were trying to attract. Now that's swimming rather against the tide of the plan. I don't think it contradicts any of the policies in the plan, but it seems to me to be swimming rather against the tide. Haringey is going to really be struggling to maintain and expand Wood Green as a shopping centre. It's also got Tottenham Hale extremely close, which has a tremendously strong representation of multiple retail stores and is doing apparently very well. Trying to insert more of that kind of chain retailing here, while not impossible and certainly not contradictory to London plan policies, I would say is very much swimming against the tide of what the London plan envisages for the future. But the protection of the market and the support of the market is thoroughly in line with policy. Indeed, my view is that they don't go nearly far enough to support and take advantage of the market and really make the most of it as the unique selling point of Seven Sisters.
Thank you, Professor. I just want to pick up specifically the protection of the market, the growth of, I think you said, micro or local shopping space, by reference to subparagraph B-E of Policy 4.8. It's another that you refer to, and it expressly states that there should be support for the range of London's markets, including street farmers, and where relevant strategic markets. would you put the Seven Sisters market in that category of strategic market? And if so, why and how does that definition work and apply here? Oh, sorry.
Okay. Well, this word strategic in London planning is as long as a piece of string. It's a slightly slippery concept. It's defined for certain purposes, like housing schemes which are big enough to be strategic, which have to be referred to the mayor. But I don't think there's an equivalent precise definition for what makes a market a strategic market. My view of it would be this, that it is a unique, almost unique, because in a way we have a slightly comparable case at the Elephant and Castle, also under threat. But it's nearly unique. It's very, very distinctive as a market open to everybody, very cosmopolitan, predominantly Latin American, with this tremendously strong culture and community surrounding it, which Carlos Burgos described so well this morning. So I think if you're going to use a term like strategic market, then for sure this must be one. Yes.
I think you've said, or perhaps explained in part, why you say the order scheme fails to support the existence of the market as a strategic market. Is there anything else you'd like to say to just explain your position on that?
Yes, I'd like to make 2 points on that. The first is that, as I say in my written proof, we're at a particularly dynamic moment in London planning. As the inspector will be fully aware of this. We've got a new mayor of London. The existing London plan, the 2016 plan, which is in front of us now, only just scraped through its last examination in public. The inspector basically said, this plan doesn't really meet the rules, it's not really adequate, but London can't go on without a plan, so I will let it go through, providing that a completely new one is prepared as soon as possible. And that completely new plan is in preparation at the moment. I've been involved with many discussions about it at City Hall, so have others. The new mayor, who is in charge of it all, is taking a very positive approach to participation and consultation, much, much more active than either of his predecessors, Boris Johnson or Ken Livingstone. So this is a new atmosphere surrounding the preparation of the London plan, with a lot of community groups and business groups, including small businesses, being actively consulted and engaged in the London plan. So in that process sense, it may be a different sort of plan from what's gone before. The new mayor has brought to bear some clear new emphases which he wants to see strong in the plan. One of them is definitely about diversity, about supporting the cultural and economic and distinctive contributions of ethnic groups of all sorts and of small and medium businesses. I've quoted in my proof some bits of his September document of last year called A City for All Londoners, in which he expands on that, and I know that his officers in City Hall are really trying to build that into the new London plan as hard as they can. So I think that greatly reinforces the argument. I mean, the new London plan, when it comes out, will be much more supportive, I think, of building and developing markets like this one as a really important part of their neighbourhoods. And I think that Haringey Council, I mean, I know they worked out this scheme with Granger many years ago, But if they were doing it now and trying to make a plan now, which really was in line with London thinking, it would be one which really celebrated the market on a bigger scale, gave it more space to expand, and a participatory and control process which put the market community much more in the driving seat rather than just be tenants and licensees.
Yes, I want to pick up the idea of community-driven development, if you like. Are you aware of examples, practical examples of distinctive or strategic markets which have resisted modernisation, for want of a better word, but still found a way to thrive sustainably as local economies?
I'm not sure that the distinction between markets with stallholders and small retail shops is that important here, but certainly there are very important examples across London and beyond where small businesses, including market stalls in some cases, have managed to hold on to their building stock, their old building stock, continue to trade and operate, and gradually strengthened and grown to become very valuable and important. An early example was Carnaby Street, just off Regent Street, which was a lot of very small businesses in the 1960s, which became fashionable and traded and became the hub of sort of trendy modern England in that period when I was a student. A much more important example, I think, is Covent Garden. Covent Garden, older people here may just remember, was in the 50s and 60s extremely run down, degraded, it lacked maintenance, the buildings were falling to bits. It could validly have been described in the same sort of terms which the Council and Granger refer to the existing Ward's Corner, in a bad condition, disrepair. And there was an official plan by the GLC to bulldoze most of Covent Garden and modernise it, to replace it with new buildings, new roads, new shops, new everything, keeping just a few historic buildings in the central piazza. There was tremendous community resistance to that, with everybody from the vicar of St Martin's in the Fields through to the market traders and so on resisting that. There was big public inquiries, and the Secretary of State in the end did an interesting thing. He both gave permission for the comprehensive development area, but also listed most of the buildings in the area. So basically prevented bulldozing, prevented demolition. What this has meant is that the old building stock of Covent Garden more or less all survived, and gradually, with the blight removed, attracted investment. Owners began to repair and renovate, which undoubtedly would happen here as well as soon as the planning uncertainty is removed. And it became the area of London that we all know and love so incredibly now. I mean, now it's even beginning to attract some multiple retail shops, but it was 30 years before that happened. So I think that's our leading London example of where a unique, distinctive, small business-based, struggling set of retailers can, given the building stock, it's not a matter of having rent subsidies only or at all, it's the building stock that really matters. Another good example that may be relevant, and I won't go on forever, the last example I would give is just outside London, but it's the city of Brighton on the coast. Now, nobody goes to Brighton to visit Marks and Spencer's or Primark or Boots or W.H. Smith's. They've got those at home. People go to Brighton for the seaside, but also they flood through the lanes and the North Lane And these are the areas where the old building stock has been preserved. They're occupied by small independent traders and have an incredibly distinctive, strong, vibrant quality about them, which is buzzing from early in the morning till midnight or later. So my answer to your question is that, yes, there are examples where through the preservation or protection of a building stock, the lifting of planning blight, through the removal of the threat to demolish, has created conditions in which some extremely strong, distinctive retail areas can emerge, and that's the sort of thing that, in my view, Haringey should have been trying to foster, and indeed should foster now, if this scheme fails to go ahead.
Thank you. I think you've explained, certainly for me, the benefits, if you like, of not having this kind of modernisation. But I want to ask about the downsides of modernisation as a distinct topic, briefly. I mean, what is it about modernisation, demolishing of building stock and replacing it, that puts market survival at risk? And as part of that, I want you to assume, for example, that new premises are created with sufficient space for a market, and at least in the short term, plots that will be affordable for old tenants. So even with those attributes of modernisation, what are the remaining risks, if any, that you see?
Well, I think it's partly a matter relating to levels of rent. And I recall at the end of Friday, I think it was, when Dr. Rahman was giving evidence, right at the end of her evidence, the inspector asked her something like, "Do you mean that markets like this will only survive in the long term if they have permanent rent subsidies?" Something a little bit like that. So that question is already in the room, as it were. I mean, I think it's partly a rent question, and a new building, a new development of the kind that's proposed here in the order scheme is clearly a building designed in other parts to attract W.H. Smiths and Boots and Pizza Express and Starbucks and so on. Generally is going to be exhibiting higher rents than old buildings patched up and made do and mend. So it's partly a rent question, but it's also partly about the physical configuration of space and the way it's managed. And a new building of the kind in the order scheme, predominantly large units, quite highly serviced, I would say, is not going to be as conducive to the proliferation of small enterprises, which is the essence of the success of this market. We've heard about some very interesting aspects of this market in this inquiry. We've heard about the variety of unit sizes. We've heard about the way in which traders have sublet part of their space, have slightly unofficially built mezzanines and stuff and just perhaps sublet them or occupied them. Those kind of flexible uses of space are an essential feature of the growth and reproduction and survival of this kind of retail culture. And it's much harder, I think, to get that in a big new building managed in a highly professional way by chartered surveyors and so on. So that's part of my consideration. That's partly why I think that the order scheme is not in the public interest and should not be, should not have these compulsory purchase powers.
I think those are my questions specifically on the market and the London plan. There are still some questions on the London level policy more broadly, albeit briefly, and then the alternative development scheme. Sir, do you have a view on when would be convenient for lunch? Shall we keep going for a while longer, or it's a new section is the only reason I'm asking?
Yeah, ideally I'd like to get the evidence in chief done before we break for lunch, if that's not going to push us into the middle of the afternoon.
No, we'll do our best, thank you. Professor, in that case, London level policy more broadly. We've gone through some of this already, so we can take it fairly briefly. Paragraph 9 of your proof, you mention the Mayor attaching weight to the needs and effective integration of ethnic minorities in general terms and specifically in terms of business activities. But I want to go back to the existing London plan first. Policy 3.1 is concerned with addressing the barrier to meeting the needs of particular groups and communities as key to tackling the huge issue of inequality across London. It also says that development proposals should protect and enhance facilities and services that meet the needs of particular groups and communities. Proposals involving loss of these facilities without adequate justification or provision for replacement should be resisted. Now, if the inspector were to find that the proposed replacement of the market facilities actually poses a real risk of a loss or a diminishing of those facilities, how much weight do you think that should be given as a factor against confirmation of the order scheme?
I think it would be a serious and important matter. And that the protection, and indeed more than just protection, but the fostering and encouragement of these kinds of facilities should be a real high priority for policy. And I think we shall see that strengthened in the next plan even more than it is already here in the 2016 version of the London plan. But I think that what we shall also see fought out in the formation of the next London plan is really completely divergent approaches to urban regeneration in general. In the evidence we heard last week from the Director of Planning and the Regeneration Officer, the Council officers, we had evidence presented about the levels of poverty and deprivation of the resident population of Haringey, Eastern Haringey, Tottenham and the locality. And one of them made reference even to the riots of 2011. And all of that was treated as the basis upon which regeneration policies were based. And this is a common attitude across London. But I think that the tremendous tension is between two views of regeneration. One is that regeneration should serve to raise the income levels and prosperity and welfare of low-income people through better jobs, better training, whatever it is, through better housing for those people. The other approach to regeneration is to say, let's displace those people, or at least dilute them with richer people. And I think the approach which Haringey is taking here, and was very clearly expressed by the two council officers, is the latter kind of approach. It's about diluting the impoverished population and replacing them. We saw that on the housing side, this scheme is losing us a whole terrace of houses, including some HMOs, which are occupied at the moment by probably fairly low-income people. And what is replacing them in the housing section is open market housing. So this is part of a process which displaces and replaces low-income people. So I think this is really the crucial planning issue. I think it's being fought out all over London. This is a really good example of it. The last thing I want to say about the relevance of the London plan relates to housing. Now, I know that the alternative plan here doesn't yet contain any housing, but as time unfolds, I guess alternative plans are likely to emerge which do include a housing content. And on this, there are important new developments going on. In particular, the Mayor of London has said repeatedly that he wants to ensure that publicly owned land, including land owned by TfL, is used to help supply truly affordable housing. That's his phrase, truly affordable housing. And I think that if a scheme comes forward like the alternative scheme but with housing added, then that could take advantage of that and be able to take advantage of a land deal with TfL in the spirit of the new mayor's philosophy.
I'm only pausing you there because we're now really into the alternative development scheme or alternative development schemes in some other iteration. I want to just pick up on that because you mention it in paragraph 11 and 12 of your proof. You talk about the new community housing hub and the mayor's housing strategy, and you say that the Ward's Corner community plan would now be in a very strong position to secure from the Greater London Authority practical support, financial support for preliminary work, transfer of TfL land, probably by long lease, and some capital funding towards the cost of the project. And you say that in light of that, the alternative scheme is now much more viable. Could you explain for the inspector what you mean by that, how far it applies to the alternative development scheme currently in existence, and how much it may apply to some other viable alternative scheme with or without a housing element?
Sure, and I'll be as quick as possible because I know that everybody wants to get to lunch. In my proof, I refer to the fact that the Mayor, in developing his planning and housing policy, has announced and set aside money to create what he calls a hub for community-led projects. I wrote that a couple of weeks ago, but the hub has actually been announced a couple of days ago. It's now public. It's been given a lump of money to allocate, and indeed yesterday I saw that the first scheme by the Walterton and Elgin Housing Cooperative for 40 dwellings has been given a capital grant to enable it to proceed. So the money is beginning to flow, and the Mayor has secured a good chunk of money from the national government allocated to alternative housing formats, co-ops and trusts and that sort of thing. So I think all of this bodes very well for the alternative scheme as and when its next revision comes along and it can incorporate housing. So that's a general point. The other point is on viability, specifically on viability, and I have read Mr. Fort's proof of evidence, and I was here when he gave evidence, and I've looked at his Appendix 8 of his proof of evidence, which is his detailed workings, and this is a topic on which I spent many years teaching students how to do these viability appraisals, so I'm rather wearily familiar with them. They're a slippery business, viability appraisals, because, as Mr. Fort said, a very large number of input assumptions are required about construction costs, land acquisition costs, what is really the market value or the threshold value for the land going into the scheme, what all the timescales will be, how much it will cost to borrow money to pay for the scheme during its construction and all that sort of thing. It's a very slippery business with big margins of error. So I think increasingly there's a tendency to be rather sceptical about these exercises. However, I do want to make a few specific comments on Mr. Fort's evaluation of the alternative scheme as follows. First of all, Mr. Fort assumes vacant possession of the buildings while refurbishment is carried out.
Sorry, could I just ask you to pause while I get the right document in front of me?
Sure. This is his paragraph 11.22 in Mr. Fort's proof of evidence. The point being that the alternative scheme is a refurbishment of the existing buildings, and Mr. Fort is making the assumption that they get vacant possession to do it. It's not quite clear where the market traders go during that period of vacant possession. They sort of just disappear off the page. But anyway, he assumes vacant possession. This is his proof of evidence 11.22. Okay? But actually, we know that what is envisaged in the alternative scheme, and we may hear more about this from the architect later today, is that the refurbishment will be done in a way which moves traders around to different parts of the ground floor, and in some cases perhaps upstairs, with a lot of boxing and coxing collectively managed by the community, so that nobody has to leave the building completely, nobody has to go to Apex House. And this means that they wouldn't need those rent-free periods, years, which Mr. Fort has assumed. So I think that's just a complete mistake. So I think he's made a mistake there. Secondly, one of the things that he notes is that the restoration of the terrace of houses facing the high road includes, in the present plans, putting back the bay windows and replacing the chimneys, which is a purely cosmetic operation really designed to make them look a bit more like they did in 1900 or something. This is something which didn't appeal at all to the council's historic buildings expert, who thought it was a waste of money, added nothing from a conservation point of view, and I get the impression that the Community Coalition would be perfectly willing to see those things dropped, and that would save quite a lot of money and cheapen it. It's also important to note that the alternative scheme has none of the huge engineering risks and costs which the order scheme has, because it doesn't do any new development on top of TfL passages, escalators, tunnels. It just refurbishes and restores and repairs the existing buildings which have been sitting there comfortably for 100 years. So this is an enormous saving in cost. Finally, on land acquisition, as I've said before, I think there's a very good chance that, in line with mayoral thinking, TfL land might be transferred to the trust at a price lower than the full market value because of the social and economic and environmental benefits that would flow from it. This is just a surmise. And finally, on the financing side, he's assumed that the financing of the alternative scheme would have to be done by borrowing on the commercial markets at a rate of 6% per annum compound. And I think that disregards the fact that a non-profit operation of this kind would be able to take advantage of various kinds of crowdfunding, funding from things like the Triodos Bank, which the Mayor of London has lined up to help support his community initiatives, community shareholding and benefactions and so on, which we may hear more about from the proponents of the scheme. So I would say it's premature to really do a full-scale viability assessment on this project, but that Mr. Fort has done one which has a whole lot of quite big biases in it, which make the scheme look much less viable than in fact it will turn out to be. Is that enough? I mean, I could elaborate on that, but that may be enough.
Just one addition. I'm conscious that we all are needing lunch at this point. Mr. Fort adopts a profit benchmark of 14% to assess commercial viability for the, or indeed any, alternative scheme at his paragraph 11.14. Now, if the alternative scheme is to be funded through the community or benefactors or some source of public funding, is that an appropriate assumption as a benchmark?
No, I don't believe it is. I mean, he was asked about that when he was cross-examined or re-examined, and he said that in his experience, even charities need to do this sort of analysis against a commercial profit benchmark, and that commercial lenders would always want to see such an analysis, even if the organisation itself didn't need to make a profit. I think that's true, but equally, the scheme here might very well be able to fund itself mainly without reference to commercial borrowing, in which case such a threshold would be, I think, far too high, and a threshold adequate to cover borrowing cost would probably be fully adequate, so something like 6 or 8% would probably be fine. So I think he's being over-demanding in that 14%.
Last question, which is really a sweep-up exercise. Is there anything further that you briefly want to add before you finish giving oral evidence in chief? In that case, those are the end of my questions. Thank you very much, Professor Edwards.
Right. Thank you very much. We will adjourn there for lunch. I wonder if we could resume at 2 o'clock. I know it's cutting down that lunch interval, but would be good to make as much use as we can of the day. So we will adjourn now till 2 o'clock. Thank you very much, and then we'll have cross-examination of Professor Edwards.